Okay, it's time. So, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Welcome everyone to AGU Plenary Lecture. This AGU Plenary Lecture is aiming to provide lectures on latest worldwide topics with easy and clear explanations. This year, 5 special speakers from different areas are invited during the JpGU-AGU joint meeting. Today, we have Dr. Axel Timmerman from IBS Center for Climate Physics, Busan National University, South Korea. His presentation today entitles Climate-Induced Human Migration. Dr. Axel Timmerman, would you please begin your talk?
Yes, thank you very much, Nomura-san. I would also like to thank Suhiro-san and the organizing committee for inviting me. Thank you all for joining this plenary talk on climate-induced human migration. As many stories, we begin our story in the distant past, about 130,000 years ago, when a small group of Homo sapiens assembled around their fireplace somewhere in southern Africa, still excited about what happened to them that day. During the late afternoon, they had collected firewood in the nearby grove next to a small lake when they saw another group of individuals that just looked like them. Who were they? Were these relatives? Where did they come from? How much land was there outside the area that their own group had already explored? Were there many other tribes like theirs? What would happen to their own tribe one day? Little did our Southern African protagonists know that in addition to their own species, Homo sapiens, there were at least 3 other hominid groups living at that time: Neanderthals in Eurasia, Denisovans, and Homo erectus in Eastern Asia. Let's take a brief look at the climatic context. Homo sapiens evolved during the last 200,000 years, a period which was climate swings, glacial cycles, like on the left side in the animation, Danska-Oeschger events, precessional cycles which could shift rain bands and turn deserts into green savannas. Archaic Homo sapiens, groups that are probably genetically extinct right now, moved into Eurasia for the first time more than 100,000 years ago. Subsequent groups, after about 60,000 years, met and interbred with Neanderthals. Unlike any other mammal, our species has migrated the farthest and settled in some of the most remote and hostile places on our planet. 200,000 years was enough time for us to adapt to a wide range of climate conditions. In this talk, I would like to address several fundamental questions. The first one is, what caused the major migration of our genetic ancestors inside Africa around 125,000 years ago? Before we dive into this question, I just wanted to highlight a fundamental concept. Orbital forcing, the major Milankovitch cycles, obliquity, eccentricity, and precession, changed the seasons on our planet. As a result, rainfall bands and vegetation patterns can shift. An area with high net primary production is likely to attract lots of herbivores, food for Homo sapiens. An area that becomes too dry to maintain high carrying capacity is likely to initiate migrations. We talk about the orbitally induced pull and push scenario for migration. One spectacular example for the impact of orbital forcing on vegetation and habitability is the Green Sahara around 9,000 years ago, when large river systems and lakes covered parts of Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula. Interesting, if we look at the transient climate model simulation covering several glacial cycles, we see that the Green Sahara was not a single event, but it occurred almost every 20,000 years in unison with the eccentricity modulated precessional cycle. Now, how can we reconstruct past migrations of our ancestors? One way is to study human DNA. The key concept here is that if a group separates geographically from a parent group, the two groups will develop independent mutations that accumulate over time. Looking at the genetic differences of different groups of living Homo sapiens and their geographic separation, we can learn something about their migration pathways. Knowing the mutation rate, we can even estimate it when they shared a common ancestor. This analysis works particularly well with mitochondrial DNA, which gets inherited only through the maternal line. It turns out that there are essentially 7 main so-called haplogroups of maternal DNA. They're colored in this map with red to blue. All of these haplogroups originate from the so-called L0 branch, whose descendants live nowadays in southern Africa, in the Kalahari region. By tracing the DNA differences, we can assign each of these different groups a so-called coalescence age. Averaging these ages across human populations in Africa, we get an interesting picture. The oldest group likely originated from southern Africa and then migrated northwards, splitting off into various other branches, with the youngest branch found in central Western Africa. Let's focus a bit more on southern Africa. Southern Africa nowadays, it's pretty dry. It doesn't seem likely and hospitable starting point for the journey. However, 100 to 200,000 years ago, the situation was quite different. What is now the Kalahari Desert, east of the Okavango Delta, used to be a huge lake and wetland system, which was able to maintain also a rich ecosystem. Our ancestral mothers may have originated from this oasis called the Lake Mahari. What other evidence do we have, and why did they start to move away? At this point, we have to meet the Kusan from southern Africa, who have the deepest rooting human mitochondrial lineage, about 200,000 years old. My colleague and collaborator Vanessa Hayes from the Garvin Institute in Sydney compiled the largest genomic dataset of L0. By carefully estimating the coalescence times and overlaying the spatiotemporal genetic history with paleoclimate model simulations and paleoclimate data, we were able to piece together a likely scenario for the first climatically induced migration of our genetic ancestors. Assuming an origin in the extended Okavango Delta region, to be precise, the Lake Mahari wetland, the first migration took place towards the northeast around 124,000 years ago. This was enabled by the orbitally induced establishment of a green corridor. About 20,000 years later, a second corridor opens towards the southwest, which is consistent with a major reconstructed migration of an L0 group, which we find nowadays in the Cape region, but nowhere else. Paleoclimate models and paleoceanographic data support remarkable similarities between genetic and climate patterns. Another fascinating feature is also that by reconstructed the past effective population size of the L0 subgroups from DNA data, we can see, unlike in other areas of the world, alternating periods of population growth and stagnation. These, interestingly, coincide with the precessionally forced rainfall and vegetation changes in the same area, which further indicates that there might be a tight linkage between climate, food security, migration, and genetic diversification. Let me recap here. The current Kalahari Kusan are members of one of the oldest living branches of our human ancestry, reaching back about 200,000 years. The Mahari-Khari Paleo wetland was a possible homeland area of Homo sapiens, providing suitable environment, and we have genetic evidence also supporting this scenario. Changes in Earth's axis caused major changes in hydroclimate in South Africa, opening and closing green corridors from the homeland to the northeast and to the southwest. Coalescence time estimates of L0 descendants suggest that genetic divergences did not occur randomly, but they were likely paced by climate. Population size of southwestern migrants shows precessional cycles. Let's address now the second big question of my talk. When and why did Homo sapiens migrate into Eurasia? There is clear archaeological and fossil evidence that members of the Homo sapiens group ventured from Africa to Eurasia already prior to 100,000 years ago, maybe as early as 190,000 years ago. However, these groups may have been extinct branches of what we call archaic Homo sapiens, branches who did not survive and who did not leave a strong genetic trace in our present DNA. One exception may be Papua New Guinea. All the genetic evidence from living Homo sapiens points to an entry into Eurasia around 70 to 60,000 years ago. This corresponds to the coalescence time between the haplogroups here and those outside. A bit strange because we know Homo sapiens was in China at least 80,000 years ago and in Australia about 65,000 years ago. So we have some interesting discrepancies that need to be reconciled. What happened climatically 60 to 70,000 years ago? From paleoclimate data, we know it was one of the coldest and driest periods in northern Africa ever, with not much substantial vegetation to support life. Bad times for migration. How can we reconcile the climatic and genetic evidences? It turns out that the typical DNA coalescence time calculations do not properly account for the possibility that there might have been a group that left Africa through Green Corridor around 100 or 80,000 years ago, and that this group backpropagated into Africa after the very severe marine isotope stage 4 Heinrich 6 drought around 60,000 years ago. Mixed there with the actual groups in Africa, and then eventually left Africa. Such genetic backflow would result in incorrect coalescence time interpretations. But even from these arguments, it becomes clear that climate, the opening and closing of green corridors in northeastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula may have played an important role in orchestrating our dispersal. In order to get a better picture of how past climate may have shaped human migrations, we developed a climate-forced human dispersal model, short HDM. The HDM uses orbital scale and millennial scale temperature and net primary production data from a transient paleoclimate model simulation that covers the past glacial cycles. In these movies, we see the combined orbital scale and Dunskat-Oeschger related swings and flickering in temperature and net primate production that the human dispersal model sees over the last 100,000 years. To simulate the dispersal of Homo sapiens, we again use the idea of carrying capacity. The more food there is, the more individuals can be maintained. In addition, we use a diffusion term that captures the spread of Homo sapiens. Its amplitude is estimated from present-day hunter-gatherer populations. If we force this model with climate data, assuming that Homo sapiens lived in Central Africa around 125,000 years ago, we get the following situation. Homo sapiens moves out of Africa in waves, depending on the vegetation in the northeastern African corridors. They then spread towards Asia, Australia, around 80 to 60,000 years ago, and eventually into the Americas, crossing Bering Strait at the end of the last ice age. The arrival time in this simulation is quite consistent with fossil and archaeological data. The key finding here is that we have multiple waves of Homo sapiens leaving Africa. However, our model cannot tell us which one was genetically the most successful. Let's phrase the third big question in a different way. Did climate play a major role in human migration and evolution? Given the fidelity and success of our climate-forced human dispersal model, we can now run various scenarios. We can start with the same initial conditions, but keep the climate conditions fixed at, say, 70,000 years ago. Looking now at the arrival time maps, left is the realistic one from the first simulation, right is the one obtained from the fixed climate scenario, we see major differences. Without Milankovitch forcing, our human migration and evolution would have been very different. There is one other interesting aspect. Dunskat-Oeschger variability would have also caused millennial scale variations in rainfall over northeastern Africa. Cold, dry conditions would have choked off migration routes every several thousand years, as we see in our simulations and in the time series shown here. So far, it remains unclear how this millennial scale variability may have affected our genetic diversification. As I mentioned already in the beginning, when our ancestors ventured into Eurasia, they were not alone. Neanderthals and Denisovans populated parts of Eurasia, probably for more than 400,000 years. We can address the question, how did Homo sapiens interact with the other hominin groups? And did our ancestors contribute to the rapid demise or extinction of the other groups? To address these questions, the climate-forced human dispersal model was extended to include also Neanderthals. Their demographic parameters were estimated from genetic and archaeological data. In addition to the normal dispersal and carrying capacity, I've also included an interbreeding and competition term. The competition terms beta here in this equation characterize how efficiently the hominin groups can extract the same food resources. Running this model for a range of realistic parameters, we can see that in the absence of competition and interbreeding, Neanderthals would still be roaming around, probably sitting right next to you in the bus. For weak competition, we see that very unrealistically strong levels of interbreeding would have also led to the demise of Neanderthals around 40,000 years ago, shortly after Homo sapiens entered Europe. If we now increase the competition level, better adapted Homo sapiens over Neanderthals, we observe a realistic extinction around 40,000 years ago in agreement with radiocarbon dates and for very small levels of interbreeding, which is more realistic. We can now compare the simulated intrusion of Homo sapiens and the demise of Neanderthals with the archaeological data. We find actually good agreement between model and reality. Green shading represents Homo sapiens, red shading represents the density of Neanderthals. Even the pattern of simulated interbreeding rates agrees well with the spatial patterns of mixed archaeological sites in certain areas from Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. This movie shows the introgression and competitive exclusion of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens over the last 100,000 years. You see the intrusion of Homo sapiens into Europe and the demise of the Neanderthals, eventually all the way until 38,000 years ago. Let's summarize. Overall, we find that in order to get realistic extinction times, 38,000 years, for realistic genetically derived interbreeding levels, we need a strong competitive exclusion. We can discuss later why Homo sapiens may have been more competitive over Neanderthals. The spreading of zoonotic viruses from Homo sapiens to Neanderthals and the use of hunting dogs and so on. These are all possible reasons, something for our discussion afterwards. Now, in the model, I can also test if the rapid climate change associated with Danskad-Oeschger events may have played a role in the Neanderthal extinction. By turning Danskad-Oeschger variability on and off in the model, I can see that locally this abrupt variability played a important role in the timing of Neanderthal extinction, but it was not important for the overall global extinction event. There is one other big question. Is there a relationship between climate, genetics, ethnicity, culture, and language? This question is, of course, very difficult to address, but there is one interesting thought. The Milankovitch-forced climate and vegetation changes caused migrations inside Africa. These migrations likely created genetic diversity, as we see in the ELSO sub-haplogroups. Interestingly, each of these groups, because of their geographic separation, developed very distinct cultures and languages. Let's now summarize the main findings from our paleo perspective. It is reasonable to say that different climate trajectories, in particular on orbital timescales, would have caused different migration pathways and subsequently genetic diversity and culture. But also abrupt millennial scale Danskad-Oeschger variability may have played an important role in temporarily opening and closing migration corridors between Africa and Eurasia. In our hominin model simulations, we can see that Homo sapiens, as a generalist, was able to quickly adapt to different environmental conditions, may have simply outcompeted Neanderthals. That is why they became extinct. We also suggested here that climate is an important driver for evolution. Moreover, the DNA stored in our cells could become used and interpreted as a climate proxy. Let's now fast forward into the here and now. Can the argument of climate, precipitation, food security, and human migration also be made for present-day conditions? When we compare the precipitation, vegetation, soil suitability patterns for agriculture, we see one area that experiences both food and water shortages. This is the area extending from the Sahara to the Middle East. Interestingly, some of the countries are highly populated, which can cause additional stress on resources. In fact, the areas with the highest population density, but the smallest amount of net primary production on our planet, include Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Pakistan. In a controversial study in 2015, Kelly suggested that a massive drought in 2007 to 2010 caused a mass migration inside Syria from rural to urban areas, which may have triggered social and political unrest, war, and subsequent mass migrations outside of Syria, away from Syria. Kelly argued that global warming may have already tripled the probability for these droughts. So we can have compounding factors, drought being the trigger, food security, political instability, all leading eventually to mass migration. Another environmental driver for human migration is sea level rise. Currently, we have a sea level rise of about 3.6 millimeters per year. Interestingly, this sea level rise is not homogeneous. Long-term trends over the satellite era show an accelerated sea level rise of up to 12 millimeters per year in the Western tropical Pacific. The acceleration relative to the global mean value was driven by an intensification of water circulation and stronger easterly winds in the Pacific Ocean, which generated Pacific, essentially the cause of the global warming hiatus during this time, and piled up warm waters in the Western tropical Pacific. The massive problems that some of the West Pacific island nations faced with inundations and that triggered already migrations were partly to about 70% caused by this wind effect. In the meanwhile, this wind trend has slowed down. Nevertheless, we caught a glimpse of what future sea level rise will look like for a lot of low-lying islands and shallow coastal zones such as large areas of Bangladesh. Migration due to the effects of climate change is already a reality, and it will get worse in future. Let's see what the future holds in store for us. Future climate change puts food security in danger. Since, according to a study by Battisti and Naylor, many crops in the tropics and subtropics already operate beyond the temperature for optimal yield, further warming will inevitably reduce productivity. It is estimated that because of this effect, crop yields of rice, soy, wheat, and other main staples will decrease by about 10% per degree global warming, unless we can genetically engineer ourselves out of this bottleneck. Ignoring effects of fertilizers, fungi, insects, it has been estimated that until 2100, and for a business as usual scenario, global food production may decrease by 30 to 40% in India, South Africa, and the Middle East. In the light of these grim prospects, the UN estimates that by year 2050, there may be 25 million to 1 billion climate refugees. The uncertainty in this number is huge because the developing situation is a no analog situation. It is extremely difficult to foresee how many people will migrate in response to future habitat loss, food insecurity, and oftentimes economic and political hardship. Homo sapiens is one of the most mobile terrestrial species on our planet. In the past, in a world without borders, this mobility may have contributed to genetic diversification, the development of culture, and a high level of adaptability and resilience against climate fluctuations. Still, many open questions remain. To better understand how past climate change may have shaped the evolution and dispersal of our ancestors, we need to combine paleoclimate dynamics, archaeology, anthropology, and genetics. This is an exciting, expanding, multidisciplinary research field for early career scientists who would like to address some fundamental questions, such as why we are who we are and why we are where we are. To understand how future climate change will shape us, our children and grandchildren, we also need to initiate a new dialogue between disciplines such as climate modeling, glaciology, to understand the sea level effects, food security, political science, and even law. The conversation of scientists from these fields can help us identify major vulnerabilities in our societies. It may be a good starting point to formulate clear and implementable strategies to minimize the risk of climate-induced human migration in future. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. Now we'd like to receive several questions or comments. Any question or comments? If you have a question, you can use Zoom chat box or you can speak directly. One question.
Okay, let me read it first. Okay. Oh, thank you very much, Brooks, for the question about the speed, essentially. How rapidly did these migrations occur? So if we look at the major archaeological evidence, for example, we know it took maybe about 20,000 years to go from Eurasia all the way to Australia. And it's not one individual, of course, but these are little groups that settle down. There is a new group that develops from there and so on. So the propagation speed that we can identify nowadays in hunter-gatherer populations, for example, is related to the diffusivity. And on average, a hunter-gatherer population, for example, in the Kalahari region covers 30 square kilometers per year. It's not very much, but this is something to keep in mind. But then also the climate itself changes, so pushing back some of these migrations. So it's not just a deterministic growth out of a box, but we see the modulation of the climate on top of this. Does it answer your question, Brooks? Well, okay, thanks. Next question is from Ayako. Good to see you, Ayako, or hear from you. The dry spirit, but okay. So 70 to 60,000 years ago, there was a coincidence between very low precession and obliquity, so the orbital forcing was at a minimum, which would have created already very dry conditions in northeastern Africa. On top of this, we have the shutdown of the overturning circulation in the Atlantic associated with Heinrich IV event, and Ayako is asking which one is the dominant, the more important one. I think it's the precessional forcing itself. So it's a convolution because rainfall is a positive definite quantity. If already one of the factors reduces rainfall dramatically, the other one can essentially kill it off. So I think the main preconditioning factor is the Milankovitch forcing. The Heinrich event effect is maybe just the icing on the cake.
Okay, so any other question or comments? If you have a question, you can also speak directly. Any question? No? Oh, okay, so one question.
Okay, so the question by Pacifica about mitochondrial DNA is, well, which is only passed on the maternal path. She asked, does this affect how we understand the data? To some extent, that is the case. So if, for example, hypothetically, this analysis would have been done with a Y chromosome data, and I have to say there are not many high deep-rooting Y chromosome data for Southern Africa, the story may have been slightly different. And it may actually be that the migration pathways or the migration history of males is different than females. So that's an interesting conundrum here. Also, if you look at whole genome DNA, you may end up with a slightly different story. But I think the mitochondrial DNA has the advantage that it's we know the mutation rate quite well. So we can make a relatively accurate estimate to a degree where we are able to link these coalescence times with the orbital cycles. So that degree of precision we need actually. And mitochondrial DNA is, I think, quite suitable for that. But the story is a maternal story here. It's not mankind in general, but I think it's at least 50% of what we're made of. Okay, then Suhiro-san has another question. Will technology advance be more effectual, more than climate change? I think this is referring more to the future, or Suhiro-san, is that referring to the past? Are you thinking more about the past? Okay. Oh, future. So technological advance, that's a good question. I'm not seeing that technology plays a very big role right now in preventing migration. The only example is for sea level, for inundation related risks, where certain countries can afford to build dikes or prevent the water from inundating villages and so on. So that is a clear sign. The other one, whether we can use better, for example, genetic technologies to move the crop yield curve, make that crop yield curve broader, is a very difficult question. So the genetic industry has managed to generate drought-resistant crops, but they have not been able to modify the very hardwired temperature resistance of plants. So that seems to be one of the bottlenecks right now, and the last 10 years have not given much advances, as far as I know, in terms of genetic engineering crops that are more temperature resistant. So when we move out of this optimal yield curve, because the temperatures increase beyond the optimum, in that case, food insecurity will occur. But how we manage, because most of the suitable crop areas are already used, is another question. But I think it's a fundamental question that deals with the survival of millions of people.